Elizabeth Anderson was tending to her garden on a peaceful Montana morning when her beloved German shepherd, Daisy, began barking frantically at the edge of the property. Within moments, there was a deafening crack as lightning struck the old barn where Daisy's puppies were sheltered, engulfing it in flames within seconds. 3 months later, Beth found Daisy curled protectively around a wounded fox kit in the scorched remains of the barn, her eyes conveying a message so profound that it made Beth's blood run cold. Her dog wasn't just a dog anymore. Something fundamental had broken and reformed inside her. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Whispering Pines. Montana wasn't the kind of place that welcomed change easily. Nestled in the shadow of Glacier National Park, the small community measured time by seasons rather than days. Beth Anderson's arrival 5 years ago had caused the usual stir, but as a quiet widow who kept to herself, she'd faded into the background of town gossip soon enough. Her 5-acre homestead sat on the outskirts of town where the developed land gave way to wilderness. The 1920s farmhouse had been restored with care, its white clapboard siding and blue shutters standing in stark contrast to the dark pines that surrounded the property. A newly built barn, garden patches, and a small apple orchard completed the picture of rural tranquility. It was a place where the boundary between civilization and wilderness blurred, especially in the morning hours when deer ventured boldly into the yard and the occasional moose ambled through the back acre. Elizabeth Beth Anderson walked with the slight stoop of someone who had spent decades leaning over examination tables. At 58, her once auburn hair had turned a distinguished silver, which she wore in a practical braid down her back. The lines around her eyes told stories of both laughter and loss. As a former veterinarian, she'd seen the full spectrum of life and death, joy and heartbreak. After 30 years of practice in Seattle, burnout had finally claimed her, coinciding with her husband Robert's unexpected death from a heart attack. Montana had been their retirement dream. She'd simply arrived alone and 10 years too soon. These days, Beth made her living writing wildlife books, using her veterinary knowledge to make the natural world accessible to children and adults alike. Her small office overlooked the meadow, and it was there she spent most mornings, before the weight of memories grew too heavy. Daisy had been her salvation. The German shepherd, now 6 years old, had come to her 3 years earlier during a puppy mill raid Beth had consulted on. Unlike the other dogs who cowered or snapped, Daisy had approached the examination table with dignity, despite her matted fur and protruding ribs. Something in the dog's amber eyes had reached straight into Beth's soul recognition, perhaps of a fellow survivor. Jack Wilson had been her first friend in Whispering Pines. At 65, the former park ranger lived a quarter-mile down the road, close enough for neighborly help but far enough for privacy. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of decades spent outdoors, and his quiet wisdom had been a balm during Beth's darkest days after arriving. Unlike many in town, Jack understood the soul-deep need for solitude that had drawn Beth to this place. The rest of the community existed in concentric circles around Beth's life. There was Margaret Collins, the by-the-book wildlife conservation officer who took her job seriously. At 49, she'd spent her career fighting for animals' rights to exist unmolested by human interference, which sometimes put her at odds with local interests. Her authority was as crisp as her khaki uniform, and she wielded regulations like a shield. Dr. Sarah Thompson ran the veterinary clinic in town, a modern facility that still maintained the personal touch missing from urban practices. At 40, she represented the younger generation trying to keep Whispering Pines viable without sacrificing its character. She had become both a professional ally and casual friend to Beth, especially after Daisy entered the picture. Then there was William Bill Hartman, town council member and third-generation resident who viewed outsiders with suspicion and treated traditions as sacred text. His 62 years had been spent entirely within county lines, and he aimed to preserve Whispering Pines exactly as he remembered it from childhood, an impossible task that made him increasingly bitter with each passing year. What had started as a simple household, one grieving woman and her rescue dog, had evolved into something locals had trouble categorizing. First came Scout, a one-eyed tabby cat who'd been caught in a coyote trap. Beth had nursed him back to health, intending to find him a home. But Daisy had other ideas. The German Shepherd had adopted the cat with such fierce maternal protectiveness that separating them seemed cruel. Harper came next, a young crow with an injured wing who'd fallen from its nest during a storm. Against all conventional wisdom about wild animals, the bird had formed an attachment to the unlikely household and never left, even after healing. Most surprising was Willow, an orphaned rabbit with a distinctive white spot, who somehow avoided triggering Daisy's prey drive and instead received the same nurturing attention as the others. The animals formed a mismatched family bound by something deeper than species. Visitors often stood speechless watching Daisy gently lick Scout's head, nudge Harper to a safer perch, or curl protectively around Willow. It was as though the German Shepherd had forgotten or perhaps never learned the natural order that should have made these relationships impossible. Beth understood, though. Trauma had a way of rewriting instincts, of creating new patterns from the broken pieces of what should have been. She recognized in Daisy the same desperate need to nurture that had driven her own veterinary career, a need that, when thwarted, found new pathways to expression. What Beth couldn't possibly know then was how Daisy's unique family would soon draw attention far beyond their quiet corner of Montana, or how fiercely she would need to fight to protect the healing her dog had found. The day Beth rescued Daisy remained seared in her memory. It had been an unusually cold spring morning when the call came in from the county sheriff's office. They needed a veterinarian with large animal experience to assist with a puppy mill raid just outside Whispering Pines. Though retired, Beth was the closest option. And something in the dispatcher's voice, a barely contained rage, had compelled her to agree. The property had been hidden at the end of a dirt road, the kind of place locals knew to avoid without exactly knowing why. The stench hit her first. An assault of ammonia, feces, and something worse, the smell of neglect that clung to places where living things had given up hope. 47 dogs were housed in rusted cages stacked 3 high in a converted garage. German Shepherds, once proud working dogs, reduced to matted fur and hollow eyes. Most mills at least try to hide the worst of it, Sheriff Dawson had muttered, his weathered face tight with disgust. This guy, Ronald Parker, didn't even bother. Says they're just inventory. Beth had moved methodically through her assessment, documenting each dog's condition for the inevitable court case. She'd almost missed the kennel at the back, separated from the others and shrouded in shadow. Inside was a female German Shepherd, painfully thin but with an alert watchfulness that stood in stark contrast to the defeated postures of the others. "That's his breeder," a deputy explained. "According to records, she's had at least 7 litters in 4 years. The dog watched Beth approach without cowering or growling, simply waiting, assessing. When Beth extended her hand through the cage bars, the shepherd had leaned forward just enough to touch her nose to Beth's fingers. The gesture, so deliberate and dignified, had broken something open inside Beth's carefully guarded heart. "I'll take her," she'd said, surprising herself as much as the sheriff. "When she's cleared for adoption, 3 months and countless vet visits later." Daisy, named for the wild flowers blooming across the meadow when she arrived home, had slowly begun to trust. The nightmares that had her whimpering in her sleep grew less frequent. The suspicious glances toward men in uniform faded. By the time winter settled over Montana, Daisy had claimed her place in Beth's life with the quiet assurance of someone who had always belonged there. It was Jack who first noticed the change in Daisy's body. "Unless I'm mistaken," he'd said during one of their evening porch visits, "your girl's expecting—" Beth had been stunned. Daisy had been spayed shortly after her rescue, standard procedure for mill dogs. The veterinarian's trained eye soon confirmed Jack's observation. However, someone had performed a botched operation, removing only one ovary. An ultrasound revealed 5 puppies, probably Parker's last attempt to squeeze profit from her. Dr. Thompson had said grimly, "The pregnancy is too far along to terminate safely." The puppies arrived during a late April snowstorm, 5 perfect miniatures with their mother's watchful eyes. Beth had converted her mud room into a whelping area, spending nights on a cot beside the birthing box. She'd watched in awe as Daisy, despite her traumatic past, transformed into a patient, attentive mother. "She's a natural," Jack had commented, bringing over a casserole during one of his visits to see the puppies. "Some dogs have to learn mothering." She already knew. For 8 perfect weeks, Beth witnessed a healing she hadn't thought possible. Daisy seemed to shed years of trauma with each puppy milestone: first eyes opening, first wobbly steps, first playful growls. Beth had already arranged homes for 4 of the puppies, deciding to keep the smallest female, a runt she'd named Willow for her slender legs. Then came the lightning strike. Montana thunderstorms could transform from distant rumbles to overhead fury in minutes. Beth had been preparing dinner when the first crack split the sky. Daisy, normally unfazed by storms, had begun pacing anxiously. Before Beth could investigate, a blinding flash illuminated the kitchen, followed instantly by an explosive boom that rattled windows. The old barn, where the puppies were spending their first supervised afternoon away from the house, had taken a direct hit. Beth's screams joined Daisy's as they raced across the yard, but the dry timber of the century-old structure caught like kindling. The heat drove them back as the roof collapsed inward. The volunteer fire department arrived too late. 5 tiny bodies, perfectly still, were recovered from the smoldering ruins. Daisy had to be sedated after repeatedly trying to charge into the flames. "I'm so sorry, Beth," Fire Chief Reynolds had said, awkwardly patting her shoulder. "Lightning strikes like this. They're acts of God. Nothing anyone could have done." But the explanation provided no comfort. Beth watched helplessly as Daisy withdrew into herself, refusing food, spending days staring at the charred remains of the barn. The shepherd would lie at the edge of the burned structure, nose pointed toward where the whelping box had been, waiting for puppies who would never return. Dr. Thompson suggested medication, time, perhaps even another puppy. But Beth couldn't bear the thought of replacing what Daisy had lost. Instead, she simply sat with her dog during the long vigils, reading aloud from her manuscripts or sitting in silence, bearing witness to a grief as profound as any human's. It was during the 3rd month of this vigil that Scout entered their lives. Beth had found the half-grown tabby cat caught in an illegal trap at the edge of her property. One eye ruined beyond saving, his thin body nearly given up from days without food or water. She'd brought him home, expecting to rehabilitate him before finding him a home in town. Daisy, who had shown no interest in anything since the fire, had approached the carrier with unusual focus. Beth tensed, unsure if the dog's hunting instincts might surface toward the injured cat. Instead, Daisy had gently nosed at the carrier door. Whining softly, against her better judgment, Beth had opened the carrier. Daisy immediately began licking the cat's matted fur with the same gentle strokes she'd used to clean her puppies. The cat, too weak to protest, had surrendered to the attention. That night, for the first time since the fire. Daisy ate her full dinner. When Beth checked on them before bed, she found the German Shepherd curled protectively around the cat in her dog bed, Scout's small body rising and falling against Daisy's chest. "Well?" Beth had whispered to the unlikely pair. "I guess you're staying." "Scout?" Within weeks, the one-eyed cat was following Daisy everywhere, sometimes riding on the larger dog's back, other times walking beside her with his tail intertwined with her leg. Beth watched in amazement as Daisy began bringing toys to Scout, nudging food toward him, even herding him away from perceived dangers like the rocking chair or open cabinets. It was Beth's first glimpse into what Daisy would become, a mother to creatures who weren't her own, determined to protect what she could in a world that had taken so much from her. Beth never intended to share Daisy's story beyond the pages of her journal. The German Shepherd's unique relationship with Scout seemed a private miracle, a healing they both needed to witness but not expose to outside scrutiny. Yet as spring melted into summer, Beth found herself documenting the extraordinary behaviors she observed, detailed notes that would eventually become the foundation of her most personal book project. "She's teaching him to hunt," Beth told Jack one evening as they watched Daisy demonstrate a stalking posture to Scout in the tall grass. "A dog teaching a cat to be a better cat." Jack sipped his iced tea thoughtfully. "Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. My grandfather had a border collie that adopted a fawn after its mother was hit on the highway, used to herd that deer just like it was a lamb." It was Jack who first suggested Beth share some of her observations online. His niece ran a small wildlife rehabilitation blog, and he thought Daisy's story might resonate with her readers. "People need reminding that healing doesn't always look the way we expect," he'd said. Beth had reluctantly agreed, sending a few paragraphs and a photo of Daisy and Scout curled together on the porch swing. She hadn't expected the response: hundreds of comments, shares across multiple platforms, and emails asking for more details about the unlikely pair. "The dog who mothers everyone." The blog had titled her contribution. The phrase stuck, appearing in subject lines of emails from strangers sharing their own stories of animal companionship and loss. By autumn, Beth had created a dedicated social media account documenting Daisy's growing relationship with Scout. Her followers increased when she shared the backstory: Daisy's rescue, the puppies, the lightning strike. Something about the shepherd's journey from trauma to healing struck a chord with people craving hope in their own lives. That was when Harper entered their world. Beth had found the young crow hopping awkwardly near the mailbox, one wing dragging uselessly at its side. Her veterinary instincts took over a simple fracture, treatable with careful splinting and time. She'd created a recovery space in a corner of the sunroom, expecting the wild bird to remain fearful and distant. Daisy had other ideas. The shepherd had stationed herself beside the crow's makeshift nest, her posture alert but unthreatening. When Beth tried to move her, Daisy had returned stubbornly to her post. By morning, the crow had hopped onto Daisy's paw, picking curiously at her fur while the dog remained perfectly still, as if understanding any sudden movement might startle her new charge. Beth's social media post about the addition of Harper to their family garnered attention beyond her usual followers. A local news channel reached out, asking to do a feature on the dog who mothers everyone. "I'm not sure." Beth had hedged when the young reporter called. "Daisy's been through a lot. I don't want to exploit her story." "People need good news, Ms. Anderson," the reporter had pressed. "Stories that remind us there's still gentleness in the world." The segment aired on a Tuesday evening, just 3 minutes of footage showing Daisy with Scout curled against her side and Harper perched carefully on her back. Beth narrated briefly, explaining Daisy's history without sensationalizing it. She emphasized the scholarly observation of unusual animal behavior rather than the emotional human response to witnessing it. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 news vans had parked at the end of Beth's driveway. "I told you this would happen," Jack said grimly, helping Beth close the blinds against the telephoto lenses aimed at her windows. "People are starved for meaning. Your Daisy gives them that." The attention brought unexpected consequences. Locals who had barely acknowledged Beth's existence suddenly appeared with casseroles and thinly veiled curiosity. Children left drawings of Daisy in her mailbox. Strangers began driving slowly past her property, hoping to glimpse the famous dog and her adopted family. Most concerning was the arrival of Margaret Collins, who appeared on Beth's porch with clipboard in hand and a stern expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Ms. Anderson, I've received reports that you're keeping protected wildlife without proper permits," she said without preamble. "Specifically, a corvid that appears to be a juvenile American crow." Beth invited her in, offering coffee that Margaret declined with a brisk shake of her head. "Harper had a broken wing," Beth explained, leading Margaret to the sunroom where the crow was now perched on the back of a chair, preening contentedly. "I'm rehabilitating him until he can be released." "Without a wildlife rehabilitation license," Margaret countered, making a note on her clipboard. "And based on your social media posts, it appears you've made no effort to prevent imprinting or habituation. That bird is displaying domesticated behaviors incompatible with release." The conversation grew increasingly tense as Margaret outlined the various regulations Beth had violated. The penalties ranged from substantial fines to confiscation of the animal. When Beth explained Harper's unusual bond with Daisy, Margaret's expression hardened further. "That's precisely the problem. Ms. Anderson, you're anthropomorphizing natural behaviors and encouraging dependent relationships between species that don't serve the wildlife's best interest. That crow should be learning to be a crow, not a pet." After Margaret left with a formal warning and a 2-week deadline to either obtain proper permits or surrender Harper to a licensed facility, Beth sat on her porch steps, a heaviness settling over her that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. "She's right, in a way," she told Jack later that evening. "Harper should be with his own kind. I've been so focused on what Daisy needs that I haven't considered what's best for the wild animals she's bonding with." Jack's response was measured, as always. "There's book knowledge about animals, and then there's knowing animals. Margaret knows the regulations inside and out, but I'm not convinced she knows much about what that crow needs." The controversy spilled into the next town council meeting. Beth hadn't planned to attend until Jack called to warn her that Bill Hartman had added an agenda item about unauthorized wildlife keeping within town limits. When Beth arrived at the town hall, the small room was already crowded with unfamiliar faces, internet followers who had driven from as far as Missoula to support the dog who mothers everyone. Bill Hartman didn't bother disguising his disdain. "This town has managed just fine for generations without becoming a tourist attraction for people obsessed with pets," he declared, glaring directly at Beth. "Now we've got traffic problems, trespassing issues, and wildlife regulations being flouted openly on social media." Several older residents nodded in agreement. Others, particularly younger community members, pushed back. "Ms. Anderson is doing important work," Sarah Thompson offered from her seat near the back. "As a veterinarian, I can attest to the scientific value of documenting these unusual cross-species relationships." The debate grew heated, with Beth herself saying little. It was Jack who finally stood, commanding attention with his quiet authority. "I've lived in this town longer than most of you," he began, his voice steady. "Watched it weather recessions, fires, and floods. We survived because we looked out for each other, even when we didn't understand each other's ways. Beth Anderson isn't hurting anyone. That dog of hers is healing, and in the process, teaching all of us something about compassion that we'd do well to learn." The meeting ended without resolution, the council splitting on whether to support Margaret's enforcement actions or create a special dispensation for Beth's unusual household. Walking home under a sky scattered with stars, Beth faced her crossroads. She could surrender Harper to a wildlife center, protect Scout from further publicity, and return to the quiet life she'd sought in coming to Whispering Pines. Or she could fight for the family Daisy had created, an unlikely collection of broken creatures finding wholeness together. The decision crystallized the next morning when Beth found Daisy in the yard with a new addition. Willow, a young rabbit with a distinctive white spot between its ears, had apparently been living under the porch for days. The rabbit showed no fear of the German Shepherd, even allowing Daisy to nudge it toward the food bowl where Scout ate. Beth watched through the kitchen window, tears blurring her vision. Some forces were too powerful, too primal to be regulated away by well-meaning bureaucracy. Daisy's need to mother, to heal her broken heart by nurturing others, was one such force. "Okay," Beth whispered to herself. "We fight." That afternoon, she began researching wildlife rehabilitation licenses, sanctuary permits, and every other legal pathway that might allow her to protect the family Daisy had created. The journey would be difficult, the outcome uncertain, but as she watched her German Shepherd gently herd a cat, a crow, and a rabbit into the warmth of the afternoon sun, Beth knew some things were worth fighting for. With each passing day, the bond between Daisy and her mismatched family deepened in ways that both fascinated and moved Beth. She began keeping more structured observations, filling notebook after notebook with detailed accounts of behaviors that defied conventional understanding of animal relationships. These notes gradually evolved from simple documentation to the framework of a book, one that might help others understand the depth of animal emotions she witnessed daily. On crisp autumn mornings, Beth would watch from her writing desk as Daisy led her charges on careful patrols of the property's perimeter. The German Shepherd moved with deliberate slowness, allowing Scout to keep pace on his 3 good legs and Harper to follow in short flights from branch to branch. Most surprising was Willow, the wild rabbit who had somehow integrated into their routine, hopping alongside Daisy with a confidence that contradicted every natural instinct of prey animals. "It's like she's teaching them," Beth told Sarah Thompson during one of the veterinarian's house calls to check on Harper's healing wing. "Watch how she positions herself between them and any potential threat. She's not just accepting them, she's actively protecting them." Sarah, who had become increasingly supportive of Beth's unusual household, nodded thoughtfully. There's growing scientific literature on adoption behaviors across species, but most documented cases involve mammals taking in other mammals. The bird relationship is particularly unusual. Beth's notebooks filled with observations that would have seemed impossible had she not witnessed them herself, Daisy carrying Scout by the scruff when the cat grew tired during their walks. The shepherd showing Harper which berries were safe to eat by nudging them gently with her nose before the crow would peck at them. Most remarkable was Daisy's habit of creating a protective circle with her body during thunderstorms, gathering her adoptees close as if to shield them from the memory of lightning that had taken her puppies. Yet beneath these tender moments ran a current of grief that Beth recognized all too well. On quiet nights, particularly when rain rattled against the windows, Daisy would sometimes leave her charges sleeping and pad silently to Beth's bedside, her amber eyes liquid with a sorrow that needed no words. On those nights, Beth would make room beside her, and they would comfort each other, 2 broken beings finding solace in shared understanding. "She remembers them," Beth confided to Jack during one of their evening conversations on the porch. "Sometimes she'll stop suddenly during walks near where the old barn stood, just stares at the spot like she's seeing ghosts." Jack nodded. his weathered face softening. Lost my son 20 years ago this August. Car accident outside of Billings. Some days I still turn to tell him something before remembering he's not there. He cleared his throat gruffly. Grief doesn't really end. It just becomes part of who you are. These conversations deepened Beth's understanding of Daisy's behavior. The shepherd wasn't simply acting on instinct. She was processing trauma through nurturing, finding purpose in protecting others when she couldn't protect her own. As word spread about Daisy's unique family, Beth received increasing requests for visits, interviews, and appearances. She declined most, protective of her household's fragile equilibrium, but agreed to occasional educational visits from school groups. During these carefully supervised sessions, she emphasized respect for wild animals and the unusual circumstances that had created their sanctuary. Daisy is healing through these relationships, she explained to wide-eyed children seated in a semicircle on her lawn. But wild animals belong in the wild whenever possible. We're not trying to change who they are, just giving them safe space to become their best selves. The children responded with thoughtful questions that often surprised Beth with their depth. "Is Daisy sad when they leave her?" asked a solemn-faced girl, after Beth explained that some of their temporary residents eventually returned to the wild. "I think she understands that's part of being a good mother." Beth had answered carefully, "Helping those you love become strong enough to make their own way." Not everyone viewed Beth's sanctuary with such openness. Anonymous notes began appearing in her mailbox, some expressing concern about wildlife regulations, others taking a darker tone. "Animals aren't people," one scrawled message read. "You're creating a freak show for internet fame." The accusation stung, particularly as Beth had deliberately scaled back her online sharing to protect her household from excessive attention. She had never sought fame for Daisy's story. She had simply wanted to document something remarkable before it was lost to time. Bill Hartman became increasingly vocal about his opposition at town council meetings, gathering a small but dedicated faction of residents who viewed Beth's sanctuary as an unwelcome disruption to Whispering Pines' carefully preserved routines. "Next thing you know, we'll have tour buses and gift shops selling stuffed German shepherds," he warned during one particularly heated debate. Margaret Collins maintained her professional distance, but continued monitoring the situation with unannounced visits that left Beth tense for days afterward, though the wildlife officer never found cause for immediate action. Her clipboard notes and tight-lipped assessments suggested the situation remained precarious at best. Most disturbing were the rumors that began circulating about Daisy's past. Someone had been asking questions around town about the puppy mill raid, gathering details about Ronald Parker's release from prison and his whereabouts since. When Jack mentioned hearing these rumors at the local diner, Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. "Why would anyone care about that now?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack's expression was grim. Parker lost everything with that conviction. His land, his breeding business. Some folks are saying he's been talking about getting even, maybe reclaiming some of his property. The thought of Ronald Parker anywhere near Daisy sent waves of protective fury through Beth. She increased security around the property, installing better locks, adding motion sensor lights, and for the first time since moving to Montana, keeping her doors locked even during daylight hours. Through it all, Daisy remained oblivious to the human complications surrounding her unusual family. Her days followed the steady rhythm of caregiving monitoring Scout's playful exploration of the garden, encouraging Harper's increasingly confident flights, and showing surprising gentleness with Willow despite instincts that should have made the rabbit register as prey. As Beth continued work on her book, she delved deeper into the scientific literature on animal grief, cross-species adoption, and the neurological underpinnings of maternal behavior. Dr. Thompson connected her with colleagues at the university who expressed scholarly interest in documenting Daisy's case. What you're observing could contribute significantly to our understanding of animal cognition, explained Dr. Maxwell, a behavioral zoologist who visited one snowy afternoon in November. Particularly the flexibility of maternal instincts across species boundaries. Beth appreciated the validation but remained protective of her household. "I'm not interested in turning Daisy into a research subject," she told him firmly. "Any observation needs to happen without disrupting the relationship she's formed." Dr. Maxwell had nodded respectfully. "Of course, the most valuable observations are those that happen in natural contexts anyway. Your documentation methods are already quite sound." As winter settled over Whispering Pines with its characteristic heaviness, Beth's unlikely family adjusted their routines. Harper, fully healed but showing no interest in rejoining wild crow populations, found warm perches inside the house. Scout claimed the prime spot near the wood stove, while Willow surprised everyone by litter training herself to a box Beth had set up in the mudroom. Daisy moved between them all, checking periodically as if taking inventory of her charges. The German Shepherd's transformation continued to unfold in subtle ways. The nightmares that had plagued her after the fire grew less frequent. Her eyes, once haunted by losses she couldn't articulate, now held a steady purpose. Most telling was her behavior toward the puppies and kittens Dr. Thompson occasionally brought for Beth to foster temporarily. Daisy welcomed each one with the same gentle guidance she showed her permanent family, but displayed no distress when they eventually left for adoptive homes. "She's learning the difference between nurturing and possessing," Beth noted in her journal one evening, a lesson many human parents struggle with their entire lives. Late one December night, as snow fell in thick, silent curtains outside, Beth was awakened by Daisy's low growl. Not her usual alert bark, but something more primal. Beth found the shepherd standing rigidly at the bedroom window, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, heart pounding. Beth peered through the frost-edged glass but saw nothing beyond the reflection of her own worried face. In the morning, however, fresh footprints circled the house too large to belong to any local wildlife, too deliberate to be a lost hiker. When the sheriff's deputy came to take the report, his assessment was maddeningly non-committal. "Could be teenagers. Could be someone curious about your famous dog. Hard to say without more to go on." Jack was more direct when he examined the tracks later that day. "Someone was casing your property," he said grimly. "And they knew what they were doing stayed just outside the motion sensor lights." After that night, Jack began making more frequent visits, often arriving with practical gifts, extra flashlight batteries, a weather radio, a new deadbolt for the back door. Beth recognized the gestures for what they were: a neighbor's concern disguised as casual assistance. What surprised her most was her own reaction to these visits. Over the months since Daisy's story had begun unfolding, Jack Wilson had transformed from a friendly neighbor into something more essential, a confidant who understood both her scientific curiosity and her fierce protectiveness without requiring explanation for either. "You remind me of my Robert," she told him one evening as they shared coffee at her kitchen table. "He never tried to talk me out of my concerns, just helped me face them better equipped." Jack's weathered face had softened. "Good man, your Robert. Wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Beth said, surprised by how certain she felt about this. "And he would have loved Daisy's story. He always said animals understand more than we give them credit for." As Christmas approached, Beth found herself looking forward to Jack's visits with an anticipation that both warmed and unsettled her. She hadn't expected to find connection again in Whispering Pines, certainly not romance. Yet there was something undeniably comforting in Jack's steady presence, in the way he spoke directly to Daisy and her adoptees without a hint of condescension or disbelief. The first chapter of Beth's book took shape during the long winter evenings, a careful blend of personal narrative and scientific observation she titled The Shepherd Who Forgot She Was a Dog. The writing process forced her to revisit the most painful moments finding Daisy in that squalid kennel. The joy of the puppy's birth, the devastating lightning strike. Yet alongside the pain came a deeper understanding of how grief could transform rather than merely devastate. Daisy's story isn't about a dog who thinks she's something else, Beth wrote in the introduction. It's about a being who transcended the limitations of instinct and species to create something new from the ashes of loss. In doing so, she offers us a glimpse of what love might look like when stripped of all expectation and category, a love that recognizes kinship across the boundaries we humans so carefully maintain. As winter began its slow surrender to spring, Beth noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere around Whispering Pines. Margaret Collins's inspections became less frequent and more cordial. Several town council members who had sided with Bill Hartman began stopping by with questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Even the anonymous notes ceased, replaced occasionally by small gifts left at the mailbox, hand-knitted dog toys, homemade treats, and once, a beautifully illustrated children's book about unusual animal friendships. Most significant was the shift in community children, who began asking parents to drive past the Animal Family House on weekends. Beth occasionally invited these impromptu visitors for brief, supervised interactions that she used as opportunities for gentle education about animal behavior and respect. "You see how Daisy always gives them choice," she explained to a wide-eyed brother and sister watching the German Shepherd interact with Willow. "She never forces closeness. That's how we should approach all animals, with an invitation, not a demand." As mud season arrived with its characteristic messiness, Beth received an email that would alter their fragile equilibrium once again. A major wildlife foundation based in Seattle had learned about Daisy through one of Dr. Maxwell's academic presentations. They were interested in featuring her story in an upcoming documentary about animal cognition and cross-species relationships. This could be an important opportunity to share what you've learned with a broader audience, Dr. Maxwell encouraged during a phone call. The Foundation has an excellent reputation for ethical wildlife documentation. Beth sat on the porch swing that evening, watching Daisy herd her unlikely family into the house as twilight descended. The German Shepherd moved with the quiet confidence she had developed over months of caregiving, a far cry from the traumatized dog who had once flinched at sudden movements and cowered during thunderstorms. "What do you think, girl?" Beth asked softly as Daisy settled beside her, resting her head on Beth's knee. "Are we ready to share your story with the world?" The shepherd's amber eyes held no answer, of course, but in their calm depth, Beth found her decision. Daisy's journey from trauma to healing wasn't just a personal miracle meant for private contemplation. It offered something valuable to a world increasingly disconnected from the emotional lives of animals, evidence that the capacity for love, grief, and healing transcended the boundaries of species and language. "Okay," she whispered, stroking the soft fur between Daisy's ears. "But we do this on our terms. Your family's well-being comes first." She couldn't have known then how quickly those terms would be tested, or how fiercely she would need to defend the sanctuary Daisy had created from those who sought to exploit or destroy it. As spring blossoms began speckling the meadow with color, forces were already aligning that would challenge everything Beth thought she understood about family, belonging, and the true meaning of motherhood. The documentary crew arrived on a perfect Montana spring morning, when the meadows surrounding Beth's property blazed with wildflowers and the air carried the scent of renewal. 3 people emerged from a modest SUV bearing the Wildlife Education Foundation logo: Diane Forrester, a silver-haired director with decades of conservation filmmaking experience; Marcus Lee, a soft-spoken cameraman who moved with deliberate care, and Alyssa Winters, a young producer whose enthusiasm was tempered by a respectful approach to the animals. "We typically spend 2 weeks observing before we begin active filming," Diane explained as Beth served coffee on the porch. "Our goal is to become part of the background so the animals can display their natural behaviors." Beth appreciated their methodology but still established clear boundaries. "Daisy and her family have a routine. We'll need to work around it, not the other way around. And any signs of stress mean we stop immediately, no questions asked." The crew agreed readily, and Jack, who had arrived early to provide moral support, seemed to approve of their professional approach. Still, Beth couldn't shake a lingering unease as she watched Marcus set up remote cameras in unobtrusive locations around the property. "Remember, you can pull the plug any time," Jack murmured as they watched from the kitchen window. "You don't owe these people anything." Beth nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "I know, but Daisy's story deserves to be told accurately. There's so much misinformation about animal behavior, especially around grief and attachment." As promised, the crew spent the first days simply observing, maintaining a respectful distance as Beth went about her daily routine with Daisy and her adoptees. Harper, now fully healed but still firmly attached to his unlikely family, proved most sensitive to the newcomers, refusing to land within 20 feet of any crew member. Scout maintained his typical feline aloofness, while Willow vanished into the safety of the garden's dense vegetation whenever strangers approached. Only Daisy seemed unfazed, her focus remaining steadfastly on her charges rather than the humans documenting their interactions. The shepherd's protective behavior intensified slightly, her patrol route around the property growing more frequent, her positioning consistently placing herself between her family and the newcomers. But she displayed none of the anxiety Beth had feared. By the end of the first week, a tentative equilibrium had been established. The animals gradually acclimated to the crew's presence, and even Harper began performing his characteristic head-bobbing dance for food within view of the cameras. Beth found herself warming to Diane, whose genuine interest in animal cognition matched her own, and whose questions revealed a depth of understanding rare in media professionals. "What you're observing here isn't merely anthropomorphism," Diane noted one evening as they watched Daisy gently herd Scout away from the property's edge as dusk fell. "That's legitimate caretaking behavior crossing species boundaries. Remarkable." The filming process proved less intrusive than Beth had anticipated. The crew worked primarily with long-range lenses and remote cameras, capturing natural interactions without disruption. Beth's on-camera interviews focused on the scientific aspects of cross-species relationships rather than exploiting the emotional appeal of Daisy's story. "We're not here for a tearjerker," Diane assured her. "We want to challenge how people think about animal cognition and emotion. Your observations have scientific merit beyond the obvious heartwarming elements." Yet as production continued, Beth noticed a subtle shift in focus. Alyssa began asking more questions about the fire, about the loss of Daisy's puppies, probing for emotional details that Beth had deliberately kept private. "Viewers connect through story," Alyssa explained when Beth expressed discomfort. "The science matters, but people need the emotional journey to care about the science." Beth reluctantly provided minimal details about the lightning strike, careful to focus on Daisy's remarkable recovery rather than dwelling on the tragedy itself. Still, the questions left her uneasy, stirring memories she'd worked hard to process. The crew's presence attracted attention beyond Beth's property. Locals drove by more frequently, sometimes stopping to ask questions about the filming. Margaret Collins made an official visit, reviewing the Wildlife Foundation's permits with meticulous attention before grudgingly approving continued filming. Most concerning was Bill Hartman's reaction. The council member appeared at Beth's gate one afternoon, his weathered face set in lines of disapproval as he watched the crew setting up equipment. "Turning our town into a sideshow," he muttered when Beth approached. "First social media, now movies. What's next?" "Anderson Gift Shop selling stuffed German Shepherds." "It's an educational documentary, Bill," Beth replied evenly. "About animal behavior and cognition. Hardly a sideshow." Hartman's scowl deepened. "Tell that to the folks dealing with tourists asking directions to your place. Coffee shop can't keep up with all the out-of-towners hoping to see the famous dog family." The conversation left Beth shaken. She had never intended to create a tourist attraction or disrupt her neighbors' lives. Her focus had always been on understanding and documenting Daisy's remarkable journey, not exploiting it for attention or profit. These doubts surfaced during her next conversation with Diane, who had proposed expanding the documentary's scope to include community perspectives. The tension between traditional rural values and changing attitudes toward wildlife makes for compelling context, the director suggested. Beth hesitated. This was supposed to be about Daisy and her family, about animal cognition and grief, not small-town politics. "They're connected," Diane countered gently. "The scientific value of what you're observing here exists within a social context that's just as relevant. How communities adapt or don't to changing understandings of the natural world matters." The discussion left Beth conflicted. She had agreed to the documentary believing it would focus solely on Daisy's unusual family and the scientific implications of their relationships. Expanding into community dynamics felt like a boundary crossed, potentially exposing neighbors to scrutiny they hadn't consented to. Her concerns were temporarily set aside when Jack arrived the following morning, his typically calm demeanor visibly strained. "You've got a problem," he said without preamble. "Ronald Parker was at the Rusty Nail last night, asking questions about you and Daisy." Beth felt her stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know about your schedule. When people come and go. Said he was looking to reclaim stolen property." Jack's voice hardened. Sheriff Dawson gave him a warning about harassment, but legally, there's not much else they can do until he actually does something. The news cast a shadow over the day's filming. Beth found herself constantly scanning the tree line, starting at unexpected sounds. Daisy, sensitive to her mood, grew more vigilant, abandoning her usual afternoon nap to patrol the property's perimeter with unusual intensity. Diane noticed the change immediately. "Something's wrong," she observed, setting down her notebook. "Do we need to pause production?" Beth briefly considered sending the crew away, but reconsidered. Having additional people on the property might actually deter Parker from attempting anything. She explained the situation in broad strokes, omitting the most disturbing details of Daisy's rescue. "This man Parker believes he has some claim on Daisy," Diane clarified, her professional demeanor giving way to evident concern. "Even after she was legally confiscated during a criminal investigation. Logic isn't his strong suit," Jack interjected grimly. "Man spent 2 years in prison still believing he was the victim." The revelation shifted the documentary's atmosphere. Marcus began storing equipment in locked cases rather than leaving cameras mounted overnight. Alyssa rearranged the interview schedule to ensure filming wrapped before dusk. Diane offered to hire professional security, which Beth reluctantly accepted. That evening, after the crew had departed and Jack had gone home with promises to return early the next morning, Beth sat alone on her porch watching Daisy gather her unusual family for their nightly routine. The German Shepherd gently nudged Scout toward the door, waited patiently for Harper to fly down from his preferred pine branch, and checked the garden edge where Willow typically emerged at dusk. The rabbit was missing. Beth watched Daisy's growing agitation as she circled the garden repeatedly, nose to the ground, occasionally emitting soft whines of distress. Together they searched the property's edges, Beth's flashlight beam cutting through deepening shadows as Daisy's anxiety escalated to sharp, urgent barks. They found Willow's distinctive white-spotted coat near the fence line, motionless in the tall grass. Beth's heart sank as she knelt beside the small body, already knowing what she would find. The rabbit had been struck with something blunt, its neck broken with deliberate force rather than the clean bite of a predator. "Oh, Daisy," Beth whispered, tears blurring her vision as the shepherd nosed gently at her fallen charge, whimpering softly. Near the body lay a crumpled cigarette pack of a brand Beth recognized from her single encounter with Ronald Parker during the puppy mill raid years earlier. The message was unmistakable. He could reach them, harm them, whenever he chose. Sheriff Dawson arrived within 20 minutes of Beth's call, his expression grim as he examined the scene. "Can't prove it was Parker," he said, carefully bagging the cigarette pack as evidence. "But I'll have a serious conversation with him tonight." "What good will talking do?" Beth demanded, anger temporarily overcoming her grief. "He killed Willow to send a message. Words won't stop him." The sheriff's weathered face reflected genuine sympathy. "Without witnesses or direct evidence, my hands are tied legally. I can increase patrols past your property, but you can't be everywhere," Beth finished, suddenly exhausted. "I understand." After the sheriff departed, Beth faced the hardest part, helping Daisy understand that Willow wouldn't be rejoining their family. The shepherd refused to leave the small grave Beth dug behind the garden, lying beside the freshly turned earth until well past midnight, her body curved protectively around the space as if still guarding her charge. When Beth finally coaxed Daisy inside, the dog moved with the heavy reluctance of one bearing an invisible weight. She gathered Scout and Harper closer than usual in their sleeping area, positioning herself to watch both them and the doors simultaneously, her vigilance a silent promise against further losses. The documentary crew arrived the next morning to find production temporarily suspended. Beth explained the situation with brutal honesty, surprising herself with her willingness to let their cameras capture this darker chapter of Daisy's story. "People should understand what animals actually experience when they lose someone they love," she told Diane, watching Daisy's listless patrol of the garden where Willow had lived. "It's not just humans who grieve." The footage they captured that day was starkly different from the heartwarming interactions of previous weeks. Daisy's movements carried a new heaviness. She repeatedly returned to Willow's grave, sometimes bringing Scout or Harper along as if to show them what had happened. Her protective behaviors intensified, her vigilance constant. Most telling was her response to a young rabbit that appeared at the property's edge 2 days later. Instead of the gentle approach she had shown with Willow, Daisy drove the newcomer away with uncharacteristic aggression, then spent hours anxiously checking on Scout and Harper, herding them closer to the house. "She's protecting them from attachment," Beth realized aloud as she and Diane observed from the porch. "She won't risk loving another rabbit that could be taken from her." The Wildlife Foundation's simple documentary was evolving into something more complex, a chronicle of animal grief, resilience, and the darker side of human interference in these processes. As word spread about Willow's death, the town's attitude shifted perceptibly. Even Bill Hartman maintained a respectful silence when Beth encountered him at the general store. What no one yet realized was that Willow's death was merely a warning shot, the opening move in a battle for Daisy that would force Beth to fight not just for her dog's unusual family, but for Daisy's freedom itself. The morning after they buried Willow, Beth awoke to find Daisy missing from her usual spot at the foot of the bed. Panic surged through her until she discovered the German shepherd in the sunroom, her body curved protectively around Scout while Harper perched vigilantly on the windowsill above them. Neither animal had strayed more than a few feet from Daisy since Willow's death, as if understanding their family had become more vulnerable. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday," Beth told Jack when he arrived with coffee and fresh-baked bread from the local bakery. "Won't even take treats from my hand." Jack studied the shepherd with concern. "Grief looks the same across species," he said quietly. "Might be good to have Sarah take a look at her." Dr. Thompson arrived that afternoon, medical bag in hand, but proceeding with the gentle caution of a friend rather than a veterinarian. Daisy submitted to the examination with uncharacteristic passivity, her amber eyes tracking every movement but lacking their usual alertness. "Physically, she's fine," Sarah concluded, packing away her stethoscope. "But she's showing classic signs of acute grief response. Animals, especially highly intelligent ones like German shepherds, process loss in ways remarkably similar to humans." The diagnosis, while not unexpected, hit Beth with surprising force. She had documented Daisy's emotional responses extensively, but hearing it confirmed by a professional somehow made the dog's suffering more real and more devastating. "What can I do?" Beth asked, voice cracking slightly. Sarah's expression softened. "Keep her routine as normal as possible. Make sure she stays hydrated. Most importantly, don't minimize what she's feeling. Daisy knows Willow is gone, and pretending otherwise would only confuse her." The documentary crew, to their credit, maintained a respectful distance during these difficult days. Diane proposed a temporary pause in filming, but Beth surprised herself by declining. "This is part of her story too," she explained. "The loss, the grief, it's as important as the joy was. Maybe more so, because people need to understand that these emotions aren't uniquely human." They continued filming with a modified approach, using remote cameras exclusively to minimize intrusion. The footage captured Daisy's grieving process with understated power, her daily visits to Willow's grave, often bringing a toy or stick to leave as an offering, her heightened vigilance around Scout and Harper, her startled alertness at every unexpected sound. Most poignant were the quiet moments when Daisy would suddenly freeze, head cocked as if hearing a familiar sound, then race to the garden only to circle it with increasing distress before slumping dejectedly at its edge. Beth recognized the behavior immediately. Daisy was looking for Willow, momentarily forgetting the rabbit was gone. "I've seen human parents do the exact same thing," Jack commented softly after witnessing one such episode. "Turn to tell something to a child who's no longer there." Beth nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The parallel between Daisy's grief and human mourning was undeniable, and watching it unfold without being able to explain or comfort felt like a special kind of heartbreak. On the 5th day after Willow's death, Harper failed to return for the evening gathering. Daisy's reaction was immediate and alarming, a frantic, high-pitched barking Beth had never heard before, followed by desperate circuits of the property, nose to the ground and ears pricked forward. Beth joined the search with mounting dread, memories of finding Willow's broken body fueling worst-case scenarios. Night fell with no sign of the crow. Beth kept searching by flashlight until Jack gently insisted she rest, promising to resume at first light. Daisy refused to enter the house, maintaining her vigilant patrol despite obvious exhaustion. Her distress communicated in soft, continuous whimpers that made sleep impossible for Beth even after she retreated indoors. Dawn broke with Daisy still circling the property, her movements now stiff with fatigue but no less determined. Beth had just joined her when she heard the shepherd's bark change from distress to urgent alert. Following Daisy's gaze, she spotted a dark shape struggling weakly in the tall grass near the property's eastern boundary. Harper lay on his side, one wing splayed at an unnatural angle, his glossy feathers matted with blood. The crow's intelligent eyes, usually so bright, were dulled with pain. As Beth approached, Daisy positioned herself protectively over the injured bird, her body trembling with what might have been fear or rage. "Let me see him, girl," Beth murmured, gently moving beside the shepherd. Years of veterinary experience told her what she didn't want to acknowledge: the crow had been shot, likely with a small-caliber rifle designed for pest control. The documentary crew arrived to find Beth's kitchen transformed into an emergency treatment area. Marcus, visibly shaken, set his camera aside to hold Harper while Beth carefully cleaned and assessed the wound. Diane silently gathered supplies as directed, while Alyssa kept Daisy calm with gentle restraint and soothing words. "It's lodged near his shoulder," Beth explained, hands steady despite her inner turmoil. "I can stabilize him, but he needs surgical removal of that pellet." "Sarah's on her way!" During the agonizing wait, Beth found herself recounting the barn fire to the film crew the first time she'd told the complete story since it happened. She described the lightning, the collapsing roof, the terrible stillness of the puppies they recovered, and finally, Daisy's heartbreaking search for survivors in the days that followed. "That's why this is different," she concluded, stroking Daisy's head as the shepherd maintained her vigil beside Harper's makeshift nest. "With Willow, it was a shock, but Daisy's experienced sudden death before. With Harper..." Her voice caught. "She's already lost him once, watching him fly away each morning. The possibility that he might not return has always been there in her awareness. Now she's watching him suffer, unable to help. That's a different kind of torment." Dr. Thompson arrived with a portable surgical kit and grim determination. The procedure to remove the pellet was delicate but mercifully brief. Throughout, Daisy remained pressed against Beth's leg, trembling but silent, her eyes never leaving Harper's small form. "He's young and was healthy before this," Sarah said as she wrapped the final bandage. "That gives him a fighting chance. The next 48 hours will tell." The crow's recovery became the center of Beth's world. She converted the sunroom into a sick room, sleeping on the couch while Daisy maintained constant watch beside Harper's recovery nest. Scout, sensing the gravity of the situation, stayed close by, occasionally grooming Daisy's ears as if offering comfort. News of the shooting spread quickly through Whispering Pines. Jack arrived with a collection of neighbors bearing casseroles and concern. Even Margaret Collins made an appearance, her official clipboard absent as she quietly offered assistance with Harper's care. "This isn't about regulations anymore," she told Beth privately. "Whoever's doing this has crossed a line." Beth confronted Sheriff Dawson with barely contained fury when he arrived to take her report. This wasn't random. Harper was deliberately targeted, just like Willow. "How many more animals need to die before you take this seriously?" The sheriff's expression reflected genuine regret. "We questioned Parker about the rabbit, but he has witnesses placing him at the Rusty Nail when it happened. As for the crow, shooting people hunt crows legally in this county." Beth, "Without direct evidence connecting these incidents to threats against you or Daisy." "So we wait until he comes for Daisy herself?" Beth demanded, voice breaking. "Or me?" Dawson had no answer, only a promise of increased patrols that Beth found hollow comfort. The morning Harper took his first tentative hop from the recovery nest, Beth found herself weeping with relief. The crow's injury had been severe. Sarah had warned that he might never fly with the same strength again, but his determined progress over the past week suggested a resilience that matched Daisy's own. The German shepherd had hardly left his side during recovery, sleeping beside the nest and bringing small offerings of food that she would delicately place within Harper's reach. What Beth hadn't anticipated was how Harper's injury would transform the community's response to her unusual household. Diane's careful documentation of the crow's recovery, his struggle to regain mobility, Daisy's unwavering attendance. Even Scout's newfound protective posture near the sunroom windows had begun circulating among the Wildlife Foundation's supporters. The footage, raw and unedited, conveyed an emotional truth about animal relationships that transcended species barriers. "People are responding in unprecedented numbers," Diane explained during their daily update. "Not just with sympathy, but with genuine outrage that someone would deliberately harm animals who so clearly share emotional bonds." The public response translated into local action. Neighbors Beth barely knew began taking shifts, driving past her property at irregular intervals. Jack organized a small group of retired residents to maintain a visible presence on the public road bordering her land. Even Bill Hartman, though still grumbling about outsiders interfering in local matters, had stopped publicly opposing Beth's sanctuary. Yet beneath this newfound support ran a current of unease. The attacks on Willow and Harper suggested an escalating pattern that would inevitably lead to Daisy herself. Beth installed security cameras, added motion sensor lights, and for the first time since moving to Montana, began carrying her cell phone at all times. Sheriff Dawson brought unexpected news 2 weeks after Harper's shooting. "We've been investigating the ownership history of your property," he explained, seated at Beth's kitchen table while Daisy watched him with wary attention. "Turns out there's something you should know about the man who owned this place before you." Beth listened with growing disbelief as Dawson revealed that her property had once belonged to Ronald Parker's grandfather. The land had been sold out of the family 20 years earlier due to tax issues, but Parker had apparently maintained that the sale was somehow illegitimate. "He believes this land is his birthright," Dawson concluded, "which might explain his fixation on your place specifically. It's not just about Daisy, though, that's clearly part of it. It's about reclaiming what he sees as family property." The revelation added a disturbing dimension to the threats. It wasn't merely about revenge or reclaiming a valuable breeding dog. It was about a distorted sense of justice that made Parker all the more dangerous. "Is there anything you can do with this information?" Beth asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Dawson's expression was grim. "We've issued a no trespass order, but without evidence of direct threats, our options are limited. My best advice is to consider staying somewhere else until this situation resolves." Beth dismissed the suggestion immediately. "This is Daisy's home, her territory. Moving her now, while she's still helping Harper recover, would be traumatic for all of them." After the sheriff left, Beth found herself drawn to the barn site where Daisy's puppies had died. The charred remains had long since been cleared away, replaced by a small memorial garden where wildflowers now bloomed in riotous color. She stood there, allowing grief to surface fully for perhaps the first time since the fire. "I promised to keep you safe," she whispered, unsure whether she was addressing Daisy, the memory of the puppies, or her own younger self who had believed safety was something she could guarantee. "I'm sorry I couldn't." That evening, Jack arrived with unexpected company Sarah Thompson and Margaret Collins. The unlikely trio presented a united front as they laid out what Jack called a community solution. "Parker's not just a threat to your animals," Jack explained. "He represents a challenge to how this town deals with outsiders, with change, with different ideas about human-animal relationships." Margaret, still formal but notably warmer than in previous interactions, elaborated. "I've reviewed all relevant wildlife regulations. While your situation is unconventional, there are precedents for specialized permits for educational facilities demonstrating cross-species socialization." "In plain English," Sarah interrupted with a smile, "we're proposing to officially designate your property as a wildlife education center. It would provide legal protection for Harper and any future wild animals Daisy adopts." The proposal was more than Beth had dared hope for official recognition. that would legitimize her unusual household and potentially deter Parker by increasing the legal consequences of any further attacks. They spent hours at the kitchen table refining details, with Daisy maintaining a watchful presence at Beth's feet. As her visitors prepared to leave, Margaret lingered behind. "I was wrong about you," she admitted with characteristic directness. "I thought you were exploiting these animals for attention. Now I understand you're protecting a genuine phenomenon worth studying." The wildlife officer's change of heart represented a broader shift in the community, a growing recognition that Daisy's family, while unconventional, demonstrated something profound about animal cognition and emotional capacity. The turning point came 3 days later during a scheduled town council meeting. Beth had planned to attend simply to submit the preliminary paperwork for the wildlife education permit. Instead, she found herself at the center of an unexpectedly dramatic confrontation. Ronald Parker attended the meeting. Beth recognized him immediately, the same cold eyes, thin lips perpetually curled in disdain, and an air of aggrieved entitlement that seemed to fill the small meeting room. She felt Jack's steadying hand on her arm as Parker approached the microphone during public comments. "That woman," he began, pointing directly at Beth, "has stolen property belonging to me, a valuable breeding German Shepherd taken illegally during a raid based on false allegations." Bill Hartman, presiding as council chair, attempted to redirect Parker to the agenda items, but the man continued with increasing vehemence. "That land she lives on belonged to my family for generations before the government stole it too. Now she's getting special treatment to keep wild animals that should be destroyed as pests." His voice rose to a near shout. "She's making a mockery of this town with her freak show, and you're all falling for it." The room fell silent when Parker finished, his chest heaving. Beth braced herself for at least some community members to voice agreement. The traditional values Parker invoked still held sway in parts of Whispering Pines. Instead, Sarah Thompson stood. "I've documented every animal on Beth Anderson's property," she stated clearly. "As the town's only veterinarian, I can attest that all are receiving exceptional care. The relationship between these animals represents a scientifically significant case of cross-species adoption that deserves study, not destruction." Margaret Collins rose next. "From a wildlife management perspective, the educational value of Ms. Anderson's work outweighs concerns about rehabilitating the crow, which was injured by human action and would not survive if released." One by one, community members Beth barely knew stood to speak in support of her unusual family. Parents described how visits to see the dog who mothers everyone had taught their children about compassion. Elderly residents recounted their own stories of animals forming unexpected bonds. Even Bill Hartman's teenage granddaughter nervously addressed the council, explaining how Daisy's story had inspired her science fair project on animal cognition. Throughout the testimonies, Parker's expression darkened. When the council voted unanimously to support Beth's wildlife education permit application, he stormed toward the exit, pausing only to hiss at Beth, "This isn't over. That dog is mine." Sheriff Dawson followed Parker out, their voices raised in what appeared to be a stern warning from the officer. Beth remained seated, stunned by the community's overwhelming support and shaken by Parker's naked hostility. "Well," Jack said quietly as the meeting adjourned, "now we know for certain who we're dealing with." What neither of them could know was that Parker had already set in motion a plan that would force Beth to confront a truth about Daisy's past that would shake the foundation of everything she thought she knew about her beloved shepherd. 1 year later, Beth Anderson stood on her porch watching the sunset paint Montana's vast sky in shades of amber and gold. Beside her, Daisy lay stretched in watchful contentment, her gaze tracking the movements of her unusual family across the yard. Scout, now fully grown and confident in his territory, stalked grasshoppers along the garden edge. Harper, his flight still somewhat lopsided but strong enough for short journeys, perched on the new observation platform Jack had built specifically for him. Most remarkable was the newest addition to their family, a young German Shepherd mix with distinctive markings that had struck Beth speechless when Animal Control Officer Melissa Jenkins had brought her to the property 3 months earlier. "Found her abandoned near the old Miller place," Melissa had explained, handing over the leash. "No chip, no collar, but look at that white chest patch and the socks on her back paws." Beth had recognized the markings immediately identical to one of Daisy's puppies lost in the barn fire. The coincidence was mathematically improbable but not impossible. German Shepherds with similar markings appeared occasionally throughout the breed. Yet when Daisy had approached the trembling young dog, their mutual recognition had been unmistakable. "It's not actually her puppy," Beth had explained to the documentary crew as they captured the extraordinary reunion. DNA testing confirmed that, but the resemblance triggered something in Daisy, a memory, perhaps, or simply the familiar outline of what she had lost. They had named the newcomer Phoenix, a private acknowledgement of rebirth from ashes that Beth shared only with Jack. The young dog had integrated seamlessly into their unusual family, accepting Scout's occasional swats with good humor and developing a particular fascination with Harper's flights. The publication of Beth's book, The Shepherd Who Mothers Everyone, had coincided with the premiere of Diane's documentary at a prestigious wildlife film festival. Both had garnered attention far beyond Beth's expectations, drawing researchers, journalists, and ordinary people touched by Daisy's story to Whispering Pines. The town had adapted to its newfound minor fame with surprising grace. The Whispering Pines Diner now offered a Daisy special sandwich, with proceeds supporting the local animal shelter. Margaret Collins had established a junior wildlife observer program inspired by the children's response to Daisy's family. Even Bill Hartman had grudgingly acknowledged that the increased tourism had benefited local businesses. The Wildlife Education Center permit, officially approved 6 months earlier, hung framed in Beth's office alongside her veterinary degree. The designation had transformed her private sanctuary into a formal educational facility, complete with scheduled observation times and carefully designed programs that allowed visitors to witness Daisy's family without disrupting their routines. "You've created something remarkable here," Jack observed, joining Beth on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. At 66, his face had grown more weathered, but his eyes held a warmth that had deepened during the past difficult year. "We created it," Beth corrected him, accepting the mug with a smile. Their partnership had evolved gradually, first as neighbors united against a common threat, then as friends sharing daily rituals, and finally, in recent months, as something more tender and unhurried. Neither felt compelled to define it beyond knowing they were better together than apart. Ronald Parker's final attempt to reclaim Daisy had come through legal channels rather than violence. A custody suit filed in county court had claimed the German Shepherd had been illegally seized during the raid years earlier, challenging the legitimacy of Beth's adoption. The case had brought an unexpected revelation when Sheriff Dawson uncovered records showing that one of Daisy's puppies had indeed survived the barn fire rescued by a volunteer firefighter who, believing all humans had perished, had quietly taken the barely breathing puppy home rather than adding to Beth's grief with false hope. The puppy was adopted by a family in Billings, Dawson had explained. They never knew its origins, just that it was a rescue case with burn scars. When they moved to California last year, they surrendered it to a shelter there rather than making the cross-country trip. The knowledge that one puppy had survived had brought Beth a complex mixture of emotions, grief for the lost opportunity to know the dog's fate, joy that at least one had escaped the tragedy, and wonder at the unseen connections that linked their stories across time and distance. The court case against Parker had collapsed when his former business partner, seeking a reduced sentence in an unrelated fraud case, provided evidence that Parker had falsified breeding records for years, including those for Daisy. The revelation had not only secured Beth's legal claim to Daisy, but had resulted in additional charges against Parker for perjury. "He's serving 4 years this time," Jack had told her after the sentencing, "and the judge included a permanent order barring him from coming within a mile of your property or owning animals again." The resolution had allowed Beth to finally exhale fully, to sleep through the night without startling at every sound. More importantly, it had freed Daisy from the shadow of her past. The German shepherd's nightmares, once frequent, had gradually subsided. Her protective vigilance, while still evident, had softened into a more measured awareness. Dr. Thompson, during her monthly checkup of their unusual family, had noted the change in Daisy's demeanor. "She's not just surviving anymore," Sarah had observed. "She's thriving. There's a difference between a dog who mothers others out of unresolved grief and one who does it because she's found her purpose." Beth's research on animal grief had expanded into a formal study in partnership with the university, documenting Daisy's journey from traumatized survivor to confident matriarch of her mixed-species family. The scientific papers resulting from this work had begun shifting professional perspectives on animal cognition and emotional capacity. "The most important thing we've learned," Beth had written in the conclusion of her latest paper, "is not that animals experience grief like humans do, but that we experience grief like animals do. The divide we've constructed between human and animal emotion exists primarily in our imagination, not in our shared neurobiology." As twilight deepened into dusk, Beth and Jack settled into the comfortable silence of long companionship. Daisy rose with deliberate dignity, gathering her charges with gentle nudges and meaningful glances. Scout led the procession inside, followed by Phoenix bounding with youthful energy. Harper made one final circuit overhead before landing on Daisy's back for the short journey to the house, a ritual that never failed to make Beth smile. "She knows who she is now," Beth said softly, watching Daisy pause at the doorway to ensure everyone was accounted for. "That's what makes all the difference." The German shepherd who didn't know she was a dog had become something more, a bridge between species, a teacher of compassion, and living proof that family transcends the boundaries humans create to separate themselves from the wider community of living beings. As Beth followed them inside, closing the door on the Montana night, she reflected that perhaps the most important lesson Daisy had taught them all was that healing doesn't mean forgetting what was lost, but finding new purpose in what remains and what is possible. Daisy's story reminds us that it's never too late to build a family of the heart. Like many of us in our golden years, she experienced profound loss, her puppies in that terrible fire, her sense of purpose, her very identity. We know that feeling, don't we? When children grow distant, when partners pass on, when retirement leaves us wondering who we are without our careers. But Daisy shows us another way forward. She didn't let grief define her. She transformed it into love for the most unlikely companions, a one-eyed cat, an injured crow, even a frightened rabbit. She created meaning where there was emptiness. Beth, too, found unexpected joy in her second chapter, forming connections she never imagined possible after losing her husband. Their story speaks to us because we understand that the most beautiful families aren't always the ones we're born into, or the ones we planned. They're the ones we build from the broken pieces life hands us. Sometimes the deepest healing comes not from trying to replace what we've lost, but from opening our hearts to new kinds of love we never thought to look for. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.